For being here today. We're going to do a little bit of a rehash of the presentation that I gave a few weeks ago at LeadSimple University with a few minor modifications. And yeah, let's just jump in. First of all, show hands. Who here has ever shipped a package via the U.S. Postal Service International Mail? Anybody? Okay, got a few people. I think we can all agree it sucks. It's the absolute worst. I'm trying to send some packages to a couple of our team members right now that I sent before Christmas, and I hopped on this morning to be like, okay, are they there yet? And all it says is your package is shipped and on the way. No ETA, no nothing. And I gotta admit, a little frustrating, but what are you gonna do? There aren't that many other options unless you want to pay an arm and a leg. And I would argue that it only continues to exist because we tolerate it, right? We allow the sucky experience to exist, and you're cheap enough to not pony up for big boy shipping, right? I actually want to draw a little bit of a parallel here between customer service in the property management sphere of the property turn and the sucky experience that we see in shipping packages internationally. Now, don't hate me. Feel free to throw things, but if you're screaming at me, it's okay. I won't judge. We're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the property turn process. So the property turn process, what I want to talk about here, as mentioned, is some of the issues in customer service that we see in the realm of the property turn. Now, the property turn is obviously a significant part of property management. In fact, it's, in my opinion, one of the primary triggers that pushes clients to work with property managers in the first place, right? You're solving all those issues that are super painful, the maintenance, the upkeep of the property, dealing with finding good tenants, all of these challenging and expensive and can be really difficult things for a property owner to deal with. However, while you're solving all these problems for them, it's also one of the places where you're having to operate at the highest level of trust, right? You're actively spending that owner's money, and you are trying to find the right tenant. They're having to trust you to find the right tenant to place in their very expensive investment, or at least what they perceive as their expensive investment, right? So when we're at this high period of trust, there's also a high level of risk. And so it becomes even more important at this time in the relationship than it does in other parts of the relationship to operate in high trust and to provide great communication and customer experience. So what I'd like to walk you through today is some ideas and some best practices around using automations and particular process strategies for ensuring that your team has a great experience so they in turn can ensure that your clients have an amazing experience. First of all, let's look at a couple of stats. 73% of owners and tenants will make a change in their purchasing experience over bad customer service. That's a little bit disturbing to me, but it's true and a little scary, right? Customer service as a practice is highly influential in your clients' purchasing decisions and whether they're going to stick around and continue to work with you. Further, 70% of your owners who call in are going to expect that every person at your company that they speak with is going to have full context on their specific problems. Now, industry-wide, we see that in general, about 60% of business leaders are seeing an increase in inbound calls and expect there to be more growth in the future. And lastly, 80% of companies, property management companies, are expecting to compete with each other and beat each other simply over customer service. So in my mind, this really elevates the need for us to make amazing customer experiences every time an owner reaches out to you, particularly around this property turn phase of the relationship. So why aren't we paying more attention to customer service? Why isn't this more visible and more urgent? My opinion is that a lot of people look at customer service with a dual mind. We look at customer service firstly and we say, this is so basic, everyone should be able to do it. It's super easy, right? Just be a nice person. But at the same time, many of us, especially business owners, are like, well, this is just one of those things that some people are good at and other people aren't. And both things can't be true. Now, the reality is here that customer service is a learnable, programmable, trainable process, right? There are methods of providing great customer service experiences. And it really is such an important function of the business that it must get some attention. So how do we fix it? Well, what I propose is a systematic, proactive, automated, where it makes sense, customer-centric communication, right? Customer service, the center of that is good communication. And that's where we're going to head. Now, I've got a client who has a PM business that's probably about, I want to say 14 or 15 years old, serving about 700 doors. And for a long time, they had property turns that were running, I think, 45 days plus. It was awful. They had really long turns. They had owners who were reaching out, clogging up the works, asking tons of questions because they just didn't know what was going on. Nobody really knew who was responsible for what. And then, of course, you got those really long timelines that I already mentioned. And as you guys know, every day that property is empty is costing your owner, it's costing you potentially. That's our biggest expense here is that property being empty. Now, the result of this was obviously a horrible experience for their owners. Now, after working with the BSG team, we were able to dramatically shorten their timelines down to about 21 days. We were able to significantly reduce the number of owners reaching out by incorporating some proactive communications. And we were able to set really clear boundaries and expectations around task responsibilities. Processing time goes down, the friction got reduced, and customer satisfaction went up. Now, this is about the property turn cycle. So we're going to dig into some issues and opportunities that we see as common to most PMs. First of all, slow turn times, right? We talked about that briefly just a moment ago. This is really the number one issue that I hear from our clients that they hear from their owners. Having slow turns is just unacceptable. Now, there's a number of reasons why this might be true. Sometimes it's really hard to get in touch with your owners, hard to get approvals, right? You send out requests to them and they just never respond, or they need a lot of coaching, or they have a million questions. Sometimes they're just not ready for the expense. And sometimes you got owners who just want to DIY, and that definitely slows everything down. You can also have problems with vendors, right? Vendors can be challenging to find. Sometimes they just do a crap job and you have to send people out more than once. And obviously you've got those ongoing communication issues. Vendors can be really good at doing the work, but not so great at providing updates. Another challenging issue here that contributes to slow turn times is inbound calls. And inbound calls can be a real challenge, especially as I mentioned earlier, when owners are expecting that everyone that they talk to is going to have all the context on all of the issues dealing with any of the properties that you're managing for them. And this can be an issue because of processes being poorly laid out. You might be running your processes through multiple systems, or your team has no point where they're sharing context. And so everything is just unlinked and disorganized. Now, where are the opportunities? Well, obviously, the reverse of everything that we just talked about. Setting clear expectations rather than just letting things float in the ether. Letting your owners know ahead of time what they're going to be looking at in terms of approximate cost or timelines. Making sure that we pre-program responses and updates to the owners on a regular basis based on what we see as best practices for our clients. Making sure that you set clear timelines for when you need to hear from them, i.e., you must respond to me within X number of days, or your process or your project rather will be backburned, or we'll make a decision for you, right? We want to set those expectations really clearly for them. Another idea here would be creating scopes of work that clearly show needs versus wants, right? We've got to have this. Here's all the extra fluff that we'd love to do if we can get your permission. Another common use or another common solution that we've seen here is providing regular updates to the owners. Now, again, this sounds like a pretty base level service, and ultimately it is. But believe it or not, a lot of people don't do this. You have a property that's on the market or a property that's in process of being turned, and regular updates are not being sent out to owners. They're not actually telling them what's going on at the property. They're just letting things live in limbo. Now, what does it take to make all this possible? I'd say it's purposeful process design. Now, a process can be as simple as a list of tasks, right? We don't have to have fancy processes just to have a good process. But by using a little bit of design and creativity, you can really make your processes way easier to use, more efficient, and also better for you guys as a company, right? Now, what does that purposeful process design look like? We find there's 4 phases that really fall into every single process that you create. There's your research phase, your inputs phase, your execution phase, and then your wrap up. And this actually mirrors a communication and customer service philosophy that we have incorporated into BSG, and I've also used in many other instances as well, called PSC, or Professional Solutions Counseling. And we're going to be doing more about that particular method in our phone mastery course, which is going to be upcoming here very soon. Let's see, let me flip down my notes here. So we've got our overall form of how we build every process and kind of the various phases that every process goes through. So let's look at this in real time. What does this look like on an actual process? You can see here, this is just a standard make-ready process here. You can see right here, we've got our setup stage, right? This is our initiation. We're requesting our inputs here, and they're requesting approval. This is where we're reaching out to our owners, finding out their feedback on rates or our scope of work or whatever feedback we're collecting here. And then we have our ongoing, right? Our execution. We've got our owner DIYs, our standard make-readies, or our extended make-readies. The process could fall into any one of these categories. And then, of course, got the wrap up. Now, what does this look like in other processes? Really, you can pick your poison. This works pretty much everywhere. And let's say a marketing process, you're going to have your setting up your listing, and then you're going to get feedback on pricing. And then, of course, your execution is you're getting that property on the market and providing the updates and ensuring that property gets leased. Similarly, let's say in maybe an onboarding process, right? You have your setup, right? You initiate the process, make sure you get all the information you need. You're going to have your inputs of your owners providing information about your property, setting it all up, right? Doing your execution, getting your property into your systems, and so on and so forth. You can see this pattern in pretty much any process that you're going to run. Now, there's going to be varying levels of, let's see, what's the right way to say it? Varying levels of primary sections of the process, right? So if we go back in our various stages here, or our realms of the process, sometimes one stage of the process may be more prevalent than the others, right? We might have a bigger section for inputs. We might have a bigger section for execution. It really depends on the process. As an example, let's say in an eviction process, your wrap up and your execution are probably going to be your much higher input parts of the process, where you're going to be really actively working on it. All right, let's move down to some additional content here around improvements for customer service. Now, when I gave this presentation at LSU, one of the key realities is that for the broader LSU audience, not everybody loves automations. They like using LeadSimple, but we wanted to cover some no-code automations, right? Some things that you didn't actually need to use Zapier for, or things like that. So we'll cover that briefly, because I think these are still important. But then we'll dig into a few automations, and I'm actually going to share the stage with Mike, who's on the call with us as well. All right, so some no automation required ways to improve your customer service in your property turn process. First of all, we talked for a minute ago about expectations, right? Expectations and setting clear ones is just good customer service. Now, you can do this just by considering the language that you're including in the messages that you send. You can also do this by considering timing, right? Am I making sure that this is sending at the right point in the process? Am I planning for my client's experience versus letting it happen reactively? Am I proactively designing this so that it works exactly the way that I want it to? And being proactive in that process design is really just another example of making a great customer service experience in your process without having to use automation. And when I get into putting together a part of the process and thinking through how I'm setting it up, for me, that always goes into questions, right? I'm going to ask myself a lot of questions in order to develop the process the way that I want it to work. So as an example here, in the Make Ready, I like to send a setting expectations message to the owner as one of the first things, where I'm going to let the owner know, hey, we're initiating the process. Here's some of what you can expect. Here's a generalized timeline based on what we know right now. And when I even want to set expectations for future customer service. So I'm keeping myself accountable, right? If our SLA to the owner is to provide regular updates on a weekly basis, I'm going to let them know that they can expect that. Because then we've made a promise, right? We are going to update you on a weekly basis. And that keeps me and my team accountable to ensure that client is having the experience that they should. But in terms of those questions that I'm going to ask, as I'm thinking about how I structure that message, I like to ask, what are the outcomes that I'm looking for? Right? What are the things that need to happen as a result of this message being sent? And have I clearly defined what those outcomes are in the message that I'm sharing with that owner? I'm also going to ask, do I have all the information that I need in order to send this message? Right? An example of this would be if we're sending out a message to the owner and advising them of details related to the property turn, do I want to include information like a quote? Do I even have all the quotes at this point? Do I want to send quotes as they currently are, or do I need 100% of them? Can I send a fraction, or do I have to send everything all at once? So we're really just trying to consider the whole owner experience and ensure that they have all the information they need to make their decisions as easily and as rapidly as possible. And there's lots of questions that you can consider here, but ultimately it's not rocket science. It's just thinking through the ways that something can break, like you would when you're building an automation. Maddie and I were working on an automation earlier this morning, and we built the automation, or we talked through the possibilities, and then we got to the point where it's okay, we think we have a basic idea. Now, what happens if we don't have the information that we're expecting? Or what happens if we fall slightly out of the parameters that we're anticipating are needed for this automation to work perfectly? An automation and a customer service interaction are obviously two different things. An automation is a little bit more programmable, right? You always know what the inputs will be, and you should always know what the outputs will be. Customer service is a little bit different, but you can still control some of it by creating clear processes, choosing what the route for that process ought to be. All right, I think we're going to flip over and dig into some automations now. So Mike, if I can get you to queue up your screen share, we're going to talk through a couple of different automations that we've built for some current and past clients, specifically related to the property turn. And we're going to be targeting ShowMojo, I think, in this first one, and how you can use information from ShowMojo directly in LeadSimple. Mike? Oh, and you are muted.
All right, give me like 2 seconds while I pull up the screen. Make sure we're Where's my share screen? There it is.
I guess that should be Mike Guyver, not Matt Guyver.
Ironically, I like everything else. I know a lot about him, but I haven't seen the movie.
We here at BSG are on a constant crusade to ensure that Mike watches all of the pop culture references that he knows the references to, but not the actual shows. Next up is Lord of the Rings right now. All right, Mike, take it away.
Yeah. One of the big kind of automations that we look at when we're talking about following up with clients and just overall improving that customer experience is this idea was bred from what people were currently doing and how we could do it better. So one of the big things during the turn process is giving marketing updates when the properties has been listed, right? And one of the old-fashioned ways that it was getting done is once the process was built in the essence of following up with an owner on a weekly cadence. So you had your first stage of your marketing was you set up the listing, you do everything you need to do in ShowMojo and tenant turn, and you put on the MLS if you're doing that, et cetera, et cetera. And then you had that second stage where you would have your follow-up or the process of collecting your tenant turn or ShowMojo information and then following up with that owner. The feedback or the issue we ran into is we're running into a situation where if your property went live on Monday and then another property went live on Wednesday and then you had another one on Thursday morning and then Thursday afternoon, you got 4 properties in the market that week, that 7-day cadence and your current workflow wasn't really great at handling would bring out your follow-ups to happen on different days of the week. Now, people could change the due dates for that and just try to align it. But as we talk about automation, we're trying to eliminate the action of having a human interact and maybe make a mistake and have it fall through the cracks. And then you have an owner calling you wondering why there hasn't been any showings or why your property hasn't been leased yet. So one of the big questions we aim to answer is how can we get these to show up every specific day of the week at a specific time for all your active listings. Because most people don't work in different doing the same thing different days of the week when they could all bulk it up into one follow-up. For example, when I'm reaching out with my clients, I like to, this is my Thursday morning, I'm going to do all my follow-up. It just feels a little bit more consistent and I can get that wrapped up in a nice little bow before midday. So we wanted to implement the same thing for our clients. Now, there's two ways that we found we could do this. If we didn't care about collecting the information from Tenant Turner or ShowMojo into LeadSimple because we just wanted the process to start, autopilot for in LeadSimple's case would ideally solve it. You would have a step in your marketing process that basically says your property has been listed. Please add it to a property on the market property group, which would then you would have a sub process for weekly owner follow-ups that kicks off every Monday for every active property that's in that group. That would solve your problem. You don't need to work with Zapier and you're done, right? Every Monday, everything that's in that property group would launch. You've had your 15 processes to follow up with your 15 owners on Monday morning. You're done. You don't have to do anything for next week. You then have your task in your move-in process once your property's been leased, saying, hey, get it out of the property group because we don't need to follow up with the owner anymore. And that works great. If you want Tenant Turner's ShowMojo information to show up, on the other hand, we have to get a little bit more creative and we have to figure out what really saves time for property managers is if I can have access to the pertinent information that I use to make judgment calls on what kind of feedback I'm giving to the owner, whether I want to provide feedback on reducing the market rent or let them know not to do anything because we're getting quite a few applicants and it's just a matter of time. But I want that information without having to go and fish for it in my listing software. And a lot of that information comes in through my email. I get an email update from every property, or I can do scheduled reports depending on which software you're using. And so our investigation is how do we bring that into LeadSimple in the simplest way possible? That's where Zapier and Google Sheets starts taking a little bit of a platform here. And what we did was we're using Zapier's looping ability, which I'll go into a little bit more detail, to essentially run information and do something for every row in a spreadsheet. And so from beginning to end, what it looks like is I need a way to populate the marketing process that's currently active, and I need to put it into a spreadsheet. That way I'm creating the base or the foundation of where everything that's going to runs off of. So for this property example here, I've got these 9 listed properties, and each one gives me a marketing ID that I need to store. Anyone who's been operating with Zapier should know the importance of collecting this vital piece of information because I get to then reference it everywhere else I want to go. Once I have this in our spreadsheet, basically it's a trigger from our marketing process, right? A Zapier trigger to add this into the spreadsheet. Once that's here, I can do a whole host of things with it. Using ShowMojo for an example, one of the big things we do here is for every property that you put on the market, ShowMojo allows you to have an email loaded in there, and then you get to send the marketing updates to that email every X day of the week. In this case, every Monday morning, we want an update of the report over the last 7 days. We use a software like Mail Parser to collect the information from that email. And let me see if I can pull it up real quick. You guys there you go. We'll be using Home Ladder as an example. Hopefully I don't bite my head off.
I think they will.
And what we do is basically we tell ShowMojo to send everything to a specific inbox that we create. And what that allows us to do is then to collect the information that we deem important in that report. And this is what the original email looks like. You guys, if anyone's using ShowMojo, you should be familiar with an email like this. And it tells us what sources they came from and all the information over a reporting period. Once that email is parsed out, that's one of the first bridges of our trigger is we create a Zap that uses that parsed email to update a process. Why is this spreadsheet so important? Is that if anyone's ever tried to search anything through LeadSimple, they run into a situation where if the property doesn't exactly match, you're going to get an error and you can't really find your property. So what this spreadsheet does is it allows us to have a step in the process to tell someone to copy and paste the listing name as is in your showing software like Tenant Turner or ShowMojo and put it in its own column. So when we get to this part, we're searching the subject line that has our property address, but we're skipping the whole wanting to search and potentially have it fail through LeadSimple by looking up at a value that we put in to ensure that we get the right actual process. And from there, what follows is we update the processes. We collect the information we want, this is a really critical, this is a really nice niche thing that we did, is we first just update the process to collect the information of the existing process. And then we do a second update. So we're moving the new information into its custom fields. And we're moving last week's information into its old custom fields from this step. This lets us get like a 2-week view of our marketing data. And we found it's been really useful for our clients because they get to reference what the recommendation is from this week in relation to what happened last week as well, because now they have 14 days to look over and see if the trend is still operating, if we're not getting applications, or if we're still getting applications, then we should maybe just be a little bit more bullish and keep our rental rate and make that same recommendation to the owner versus having like just this week's view to look at. And something I like to do is we like to add the actual report as a note, because then we get to store the historical data. And this lives in its parent marketing process. So this big marketing process that's going to be running while the property is leased, it just lives there. So if I ever need to look back, or my client ever needs to look back into and say what's been going on over the last month because the property's been listed for a whole month, I have this quick information that I can access that I don't need to jump everywhere to look at. All this information just really lines into our final loop, which is not here. My foldering is not as great as I'd like it to be.
Bear with us here, guys. This is where we build so many automations that sometimes it's hard to keep track of them all, which is a bad problem to have, but the beauty of it is all you have to do is work on your naming, and then you get something pretty tight.
Great weekly first. This is kind of the current process. This one, all right. This leads to this little human without arms process. It really is the whole golden apple here is looping. And I'll try to explain it as best I can because looping can get very complicated very fast. But the essence of looping is I want to do the same action for every specific item that I have. And in this case, I want to do the same action for every row. So what I tell my looping function is for every row that I have that has information inside my spreadsheet, I want to run the same operation. And
just to clarify on that, Mike, you're saying that because these are all properties that are currently on the market right now.
Yes. And the alternative would be to build 2 or 3 different zaps, which we used to do, right? This is something we used to operate with because honestly, looping was a little scary. But what we used to do is we used to have all of these processes have a zap that puts all of this into a new spreadsheet. And Google Sheets has another trigger that for every new row that gets created, something can also happen. So you would have a third zap that effectively creates the action based off every row. Found that looping really shrinks this up. And with the effort of trying to be efficient, we want our automations to run with the minimal amount of extra zaps as possible, because it just makes it easier to troubleshoot, makes it easier to keep your stuff organized, and you can run multiple things in your process. For example, I have one zap that both starts and adds it to the spreadsheet and also removes it from the spreadsheet. So I have the one task trigger doing both things depending on which one is true using pathing. And we used to have just separate zaps that did that. And we found it's the same automation we're trying to build. So if we can shrink that down further, then that would be more effective to review. As we're looking at this, running back to loops, our goal, yes, is to create a process and update that weekly owner follow-up with all the ShowMojo information we've received for every single property that's on the market. And so one of the functions we use is Google Sheets allows us to get many spreadsheet rows and we get them as line items. So I'll try and edit a draft and see if we can populate a bit of this so I can show you guys what that looks like. But basically, Google will get this trigger will get you the row. So row 6 and all the information for row 6, row 9 and all the information for row 9. Every single row that has information in it is effectively a line item. And I want my automation of my looping function to run for every single line item. Now in looping, I have to explain to it what each column has to be and what the line item is I want to output. In this case, I just wanted to give it my process ID and my row ID because those are the 2 things I want to track. So I'm going to retest that step. And as you see, we have several loop iterations. We have all the way up to 26. That means there are 26 properties on the market for this client right now. And for each row that's on that spreadsheet, I was looking at another spreadsheet real quick. We have the information, right? So line item 6 gives us the row, gives us the marketing process ID. The reason I want this, and I know it becomes a bit of a spider web, is because all of the ShowMojo and tenant turner information that I ever wanted to collect should only live in one process. It makes it easier for me to now collect it from that ID that we stored very early on in our workflow to then get that process and create that weekly follow-up with all that information in hand. We don't want MailParser to create the process because it can create a very disjointed thing, right? Because we want everything to funnel to one spot. So then when we build things outside of there, and that's the big concept to keep in mind, is when we build things outside of that one spot, we can always reference the same thing. Whereas if we build to capture information or do something out of different funnels or different areas, in this case, if we decided to run the weekly follow-ups independently of a marketing process, we may run into an issue where we don't see where an error is happening or we don't get an update and I can't verify that my automation is working correctly. And it's just a lot harder to troubleshoot. If you guys wanted insight as to why all of this workaround to make sure everything's in one neat process that we can now collect all the information from.
So Mike, bring us home on this. Where does this end up and what's the ultimate value proposition for a PM who's using this type of automation?
The ultimate value proposition is we have one space, like one. If anyone's worked with Zapier, you know that the building parts is where it gets funky. But once it's built, your users never have to really see it. And the important part is, I now have a process that gives me weekly follow-ups. Let's see if we can find one here. Weekly. I now have a process that I can look at. It will automatically default everything I want, and it will give me show all of the reports in one place. So instead of walking through let's look at a team meeting to look at my ShowMojo reports, and then let's take these ShowMojo reports and go into an email and draft this information manually and copy and paste this. All of this lives in here, and the email they get to send is neatly packaged up with all the information parsing and connecting through here without me ever having to go to my emails to pull this information from ShowMojo. And so my communication with my owners gets a lot more consistent. It gets predictable. Having follow-up on status updates being predictable is really clean, right? Your owners will likely want one or two pieces of information, which is maybe like number of applicants and number of people interested in the property. So knowing that they're getting the same consistent report for all of their properties in the same space will give them a sense of security. And it also ensures that your follow-up is in a timely manner. So your owner isn't calling, wondering why the property hasn't received anything in the last 2 weeks.
Love it. And I think this is such a great example of a place where automation can be really high value without actually being an automating of the email, right? The automating of the email is a super low-hanging fruit. That's not even what we're talking about here because it's not really needed at this point. But the automation of getting the data that you need from one place to the other to make your process of doing the thing easier, that's the value here. Right? We're making it easier for your team to do work. And that's ultimately the win for them, which makes it better for your clients. If your team is having a great experience, your clients are going to have a better experience. Mike, thanks for taking us through that. That was awesome. Definitely a bit of a fire hose to the face, I think, for most. But if you want to find out more about how to do things like this, you should definitely stick around, be a part of Processes Made Simple, or if you'd be curious to have the Blacksheep Global team do some of this for you, we would love to talk with you about that. I'll throw just a booking link in the chat if you're interested in talking about this more. We'd be delighted to see how we can help you in your business build more automations and cool technology.